on the evening of March 14, 1983, inside a dimly lit bar on Connecticut Avenue in Washington, D.C. A man named Frank Delano wiped down the mahogany counter with the same practiced motion he had performed 10,000 times before. The jukebox played something forgettable. The smoke hung thick beneath yellow lights. And sitting alone at the far end of the bar, nursing his third vodka tonic of the night, was a man Frank knew only as Mr. Volkov, a quiet regular who always paid in cash, always left exactly 15%, and always made phone calls from the payphone near the restroom at precisely 9:45. Frank had served thousands of customers in his 22 years behind that bar. He remembered faces not because he cared, but because forgetting them felt like a small death of attention in a world that demanded you notice. Nothing. Mr. Volkov had been coming in every Tuesday and Friday for 8 months. He never smiled. He never complained. He spoke English with an accent Frank couldn't place, something Eastern European, maybe Russian, maybe Polish. It didn't matter. Washington was full of diplomats and embassy workers and men whose lives were built on secrets they couldn't share, and loneliness they couldn't escape. But on that particular night, Frank noticed something different. Mr. Volkov received a phone call at the bar, something that had never happened before. The bartender watched as the man's face drained of color, watched his hand tremble slightly as he set down his glass, watched him glance toward the door with the kind of fear that makes a man's pupils dilate even in dim light. When Mr. Volkov left 20 minutes later, he forgot his newspaper on the bar. Frank picked it up to throw it away and noticed a small envelope tucked inside, unsealed, containing what looked like photographs. He didn't open it. He simply set it aside, thinking the man might return for it. He didn't. 3 days later, Frank mentioned it to his friend Detective Ray Kowalski during their usual Sunday breakfast at the diner on K Street. It was the kind of offhand comment you make when you're trying to fill silence between bites of eggs and bacon. Nothing significant. Just an observation about a nervous customer and a forgotten envelope. Ray nodded, half listening, more interested in his coffee than in bar gossip. But something about the detail stuck with him. The regular schedule, the payphone calls, the sudden panic, the photographs. Ray was a good cop, the kind who trusted his instincts even when logic said there was nothing there. The next morning, he made a single phone call to a contact at the FBI field office, repeating what Frank had told him, expecting nothing to come of it. That phone call triggered a sequence of events that would take 5 years to fully unfold, involving 3 intelligence agencies, 2 countries, and the quiet dismantling of a spy network that had been operating on American soil since 1976. Frank Delano never knew. Not until much later. Not until the man he knew as Mr. Volkov was exposed as Yuri Antonovich Volkov, a KGB illegal, a deep cover operative with no diplomatic immunity, no official ties to the Soviet Union. Living under a constructed identity so convincing that even his neighbors believed he was a Ukrainian immigrant, who worked in quality control at a telecommunications firm. The bartender had simply noticed what he wasn't supposed to notice. And in the silent machinery of Cold War espionage, noticing was enough. The year 1983 sat heavy on the world like a winter that wouldn't break. The Cold War had long since stopped being a metaphor. It was the temperature of the planet. The air people breathed. The logic by which nations made decisions that could annihilate millions in less than 30 minutes. Ronald Reagan had been president for 2 years, and his rhetoric toward the Soviet Union was sharp enough to cut glass. He called it an evil empire. The Soviets called America the imperialist aggressor. Both sides built weapons they prayed they'd never use and prepared for wars they insisted they didn't want. Washington, D.C. in those years was a city of marble monuments and whispered suspicions, where every embassy was a fortress and every diplomat was presumed to be something more. The KGB had a massive presence legal officers working under diplomatic cover at the Soviet embassy on Wisconsin Avenue. And illegals, the ghosts, people like Volkov, who had no connection to any official Soviet institution, who had been inserted into American society years earlier with fabricated backgrounds, falsified documents, and instructions to live quiet, unremarkable lives until they were activated. The CIA knew they were there. The FBI knew they were there. But finding them was like searching for a specific grain of sand on a beach. Illegals didn't make mistakes. They didn't draw attention. They blended. And Yuri Volkov had blended perfectly. His cover identity was that of Viktor Kuznetsov, a 52-year-old engineer who had immigrated from Soviet Ukraine in 1975, claiming political asylum after the death of his wife. He rented a modest apartment in Arlington, Virginia. He drove a used Buick. He paid his taxes. He had no criminal record, no suspicious associations, no red flags. He worked at a mid-sized contractor that provided components for telecommunications infrastructure, a job that gave him access to technical specifications, bidding processes, and occasionally defense-related contracts. His task was simple: collect information, assess vulnerabilities, and pass along anything of value through a network of couriers and dead drops. He had done this for 7 years without incident. His life was a performance so well rehearsed that he had almost forgotten the man he used to be. But in espionage, the difference between safety and catastrophe is often a single moment of carelessness, a single broken pattern, a single human error. Frank Delano didn't think of himself as observant. He thought of himself as tired. Bartending was a job that made you old faster than the years alone could manage. The late nights, the cigarette smoke, the drunk confessions, the loneliness of other people seeping into your skin until you couldn't tell where their sadness ended and yours began. He was 47 years old, divorced. Living in a one-bedroom walk-up in Northeast D.C., his daughter was in college in North Carolina and called once a month out of obligation. His ex-wife had remarried a dentist. Frank's life had narrowed to a series of routines: wake up, work, sleep, repeat. The bar where he worked was called the Federal Lounge, a name that attracted government workers, lobbyists, and the occasional journalist looking for a quiet drink away from the hill. It wasn't glamorous. The stools were cracked leather. The mirror behind the bar was cloudy with age. But it was the kind of place where people felt anonymous, and anonymity, in Washington, was a valuable commodity. Frank had seen it all: congressmen drinking away bad votes, aides sobbing over firings, lawyers celebrating wins that meant nothing in the long run. He'd learned to listen without hearing, to watch without seeing. It was a survival skill in a city where everyone had something to hide. Mr. Volkov, Victor. As he introduced himself the first time he came in, had seemed like all the others. Polite, reserved. He ordered the same drink every time, vodka tonic with a lime wedge, and he always sat in the same spot, third stool from the end, where he could see both the entrance and the back hallway. Frank noticed that, but he didn't think much of it. Lots of people had their preferred seats. Volkov always came alone. He never struck up conversations with other patrons. He read the newspaper, sometimes a book, usually something in English, occasionally something in a language Frank didn't recognize. He made his phone calls like clockwork. Tuesday and Friday nights, 9:45, same payphone, same brief conversations that never lasted more than 3 minutes. Frank had once asked him casually why he didn't just get a cell phone. They were becoming more common by then. Bulky things that important people carried in leather cases. Volkov had smiled thinly and said he didn't trust them. Something about privacy. Frank had nodded and moved on. Privacy was something people in this city talked about a lot, usually right before they violated someone else's. The night everything changed had started like any other. March was cold that year, the kind of damp chill that worked its way into your bones and stayed there. Frank had arrived at the bar at 4 in the afternoon to prep for the evening shift. He sliced limes, restocked the beer cooler, wiped down the bottles on the shelf. By 6, the first customers trickled in: a couple of lawyers, a woman who worked at the State Department, a man Frank didn't recognize who drank 2 beers and left. Volkov arrived at 8:30, exactly on schedule. He ordered his vodka tonic. He opened his newspaper. Frank poured drinks, made small talk, kept the bar running. At 9:30, Volkov glanced at his watch, a cheap Timex. Nothing flashy, and folded his newspaper. Frank expected him to walk toward the payphone, same as always. But instead, the bar's phone rang. It was an old rotary phone mounted on the wall behind the bar, the kind that barely got used anymore. Frank picked it up, expecting a reservation or a wrong number. The voice on the other end was male, accented, and asked for Victor. Frank glanced down the bar at Volkov, who was already looking at him with an expression Frank couldn't quite read. He handed the phone over. Volkov took it, said a few words in what sounded like Russian, then his face changed. The color left his skin, his jaw tightened. His hand, the one holding the receiver, began to shake just enough for Frank to notice. The conversation lasted less than a minute. Volkov hung up, drained the rest of his drink in one swallow, and stood. He pulled out his wallet, placed a $20 bill on the bar, far more than the drink cost, and walked toward the door without a word. Frank called after him, said he'd forgotten his newspaper. Volkov didn't turn around. The door swung shut, and he was gone. Frank picked up the newspaper to throw it away and saw the envelope. It was small, manila, unsealed. Inside were 3 photographs, black and white, grainy, showing what looked like documents pages with typed text, diagrams, maybe blueprints. Frank couldn't make sense of them. He thought about running after Volkov, but the man was already gone, and besides, it wasn't Frank's business. He put the envelope under the bar and figured Volkov would come back for it. He didn't. Not that week. Not the next. Frank asked the other bartenders if they'd seen him. No one had. After 2 weeks, Frank assumed the man had moved, changed bars, or simply decided to drink at home like so many people eventually did. The envelope stayed under the bar, forgotten, until that Sunday breakfast with Ray. Detective Ray Kowalski was the kind of cop who still believed the job meant something. He'd been with the D.C. Metropolitan Police for 19 years, working everything from vice to homicide, and he'd learned that most crimes were solved not through brilliance, but through luck and persistence. He and Frank had known each other since high school, back when D.C. was a different city and both of them had different dreams. They met for breakfast once a month, a tradition that had survived marriages, divorces, and the grinding weight of middle age. That Sunday, Frank told him about Volkov, about the phone call, the photographs, the disappearance. He didn't think it was important, just a weird story, the kind of thing that happens in bars. Ray listened, nodded, asked a few questions. What did the guy look like? Where did he say he worked? How long had he been coming in? Frank answered as best he could, but the truth was, he didn't know much. Volkov had been a ghost long before he vanished. Ray didn't think much of it either, not at first. But later that night, lying in bed, unable to sleep, something about the story nagged at him. The regular schedule, the payphone routine, the sudden panic, the photographs. In his years as a cop, Ray had learned to recognize patterns, and this one felt wrong. The next morning he called an old contact at the FBI, a guy named Peterson who worked in counterintelligence. Ray explained the situation, half expecting to be laughed off the phone. Instead, Peterson went quiet. Then he asked Ray to repeat everything, slowly, and to get the envelope from Frank as soon as possible. Within 48 hours, the envelope was in FBI hands. The photographs inside showed classified documents related to a communications satellite program technical specifications, security protocols, project timelines. The documents were real. The leak was active. And Viktor Kuznetsov, the quiet man who drank vodka tonics and made phone calls at 9:45, was suddenly the subject of a federal investigation. The FBI moved carefully. They didn't arrest him immediately. Instead, they watched. They traced his movements, tapped his phone, surveilled his apartment, followed him to work. They wanted to know who he was meeting, how he was passing information, who else was involved. Counterintelligence operations are not about catching one person, they're about mapping the entire network, identifying every link, every courier, every control officer. Volkov had no idea he was being watched. He continued his life, cautious but not panicked. He stopped going to the Federal Lounge, which the FBI noted. He changed his phone patterns, which they also noted. But he didn't run. Running would have confirmed guilt. So he stayed, and he waited, and he hoped the forgotten envelope was just a careless mistake that no one would notice. He was wrong. The investigation expanded. The FBI brought in the CIA, who had files on Volkov dating back to his entry into the United States in 1975. They discovered that his entire identity was fabricated, that the real Viktor Kuznetsov had died in a labor camp in Siberia in 1973, and that the man living in Arlington was a KGB officer named Yuri Antonovich Volkov. Trained at the Red Banner Institute, inserted into America as part of a long-term penetration program. They identified his handler, a cultural attaché at the Soviet embassy who had diplomatic immunity and couldn't be touched. They identified 2 couriers, both American citizens, both motivated by ideology rather than money. They identified dead drops, coded messages, an entire system that had been operating undetected for years. And it all traced back to a bartender who noticed a man's hands shaking and a newspaper left on a bar. The FBI's surveillance of Yuri Volkov stretched across months like a wire-pulled taut, invisible but thrumming with tension. They photographed him buying groceries at the Safeway on Columbia Pike. They recorded him eating lunch alone at a Vietnamese restaurant in Clarendon. They watched him attend a church service at a Russian Orthodox cathedral, though he never took communion and left before the liturgy ended. Every movement was catalogued, every interaction analyzed. Every deviation from routine noted in reports that piled up in a windowless office in the J. Edgar Hoover building. The FBI wanted more than Volkov. They wanted the network. In the logic of counterintelligence, one spy is a problem. A network is an opportunity. If they arrested Volkov immediately, the others would scatter, disappear into new identities, new cities, new lives. The Soviets would simply send replacements. But if they could map the entire operation, identify every player, understand the full scope of the penetration, they could roll up the network in a single coordinated strike. So they waited. Then they watched. And Volkov, unaware that his life had become a performance observed by an audience he couldn't see, continued playing his role. The handler was identified first. His name was Dmitry Reznikov, officially listed as a cultural liaison at the Soviet embassy, responsible for organizing art exhibitions and literary exchanges. In reality, he was a KGB officer operating under diplomatic cover, part of Line KR, the counterintelligence directorate responsible for protecting Soviet operations abroad and managing illegals like Volkov. Reznikov was 43, married, father of 2 children who attended the Soviet school on Wisconsin Avenue. He drove a black Volvo sedan with diplomatic plates. He lived in a guarded compound in northwest D.C., where most Soviet diplomats resided. A cluster of buildings surrounded by fences and cameras, a small piece of Moscow transplanted onto American soil. The FBI couldn't touch him. Diplomatic immunity meant he could commit almost any crime short of murder, and the worst consequence would be expulsion from the country. But they could watch him, and through watching him, they could see the threads of the operation. Reznikov met Volkov 3 times during the surveillance period. The meetings were brief, carefully choreographed, designed to look accidental. Once at a public library in Arlington, where they happened to be browsing the same section. Once at a park near the Potomac, where they sat on separate benches reading newspapers, never speaking, never acknowledging each other. Once at a farmer's market in DuPont Circle, where they stood near the same vegetable stand, close enough to exchange words under the noise of commerce. The FBI photographed all 3 meetings from a distance, using telephoto lenses and directional microphones that captured fragments of sound but never full conversations. The tradecraft was professional, careful, exactly what you'd expect from officers trained in Moscow's best schools. But professional didn't mean perfect. During the farmer's market meeting, Reznikov passed something to Volkov, a small object, maybe a roll of film, maybe a memory card. The surveillance team couldn't tell. The exchange lasted less than 2 seconds, a brush pass so smooth it looked like 2 strangers accidentally bumping into each other. But the FBI cameras caught it, frame by frame, in photographs that would later be used in classified briefings to demonstrate Soviet operational methods. The couriers were harder to find. They didn't have diplomatic cover. They weren't foreign nationals. They were Americans, which made them traitors in the eyes of the law and far more dangerous in the eyes of the intelligence community. A foreign spy can be expelled. An American spy has to be prosecuted, which means trials, evidence, public exposure. All the messy complications of a legal system designed for transparency in a business that thrives on secrecy. The first courier was identified through patient observation. His name was Robert Marsh, 36 years old, employed as a staff researcher at the Library of Congress. He had access to vast amounts of information, much of it unclassified but useful when aggregated congressional reports, technical papers, policy analyses, the kind of open-source intelligence that seems harmless in isolation but becomes valuable when assembled by someone who knows what to look for. Marsh had no criminal record, no suspicious travel history, no obvious connection to the Soviet Union. He was unmarried, lived in a modest apartment in Alexandria, drove a Toyota Corolla that was 8 years old and badly needed a muffler. He seemed unremarkable in every way except one. He visited the same bench in Rock Creek Park every Thursday afternoon at 4 o'clock, where he sat for exactly 15 minutes, reading a book or feeding pigeons, and then left. The FBI noticed that Volkov also visited Rock Creek Park, though on different days and different times, but twice during the surveillance. Their visits overlapped by location, though not by time. Volkov would sit on the bench at 2 in the afternoon, leave something behind. A newspaper or a folded map wedged into the slats of the bench, and Marsh would arrive 2 hours later, sit in the same spot, retrieve the item, and walk away. A dead drop. One of the oldest techniques in espionage, effective precisely because it requires no direct contact, no conversation, no moment where two people can be photographed together and linked. The FBI watched Marsh for 6 weeks. They searched his apartment when he was at work, carefully, leaving no trace, photographing documents, examining his books, looking for anything that would confirm he was knowingly working for Soviet intelligence, and not just an unwitting participant in something he didn't understand. They found a collection of Marxist literature, copies of works by Lenin and Gramsci, underlined and annotated. They found letters to friends expressing disillusionment with American foreign policy, anger over Vietnam, disgust with corporate capitalism. They found a journal where he wrote about his belief that the Soviet Union, despite its flaws, represented humanity's best hope for a future without exploitation. Marsh was an ideological recruit. He wasn't being paid. He wasn't being blackmailed. He believed he was doing the right thing, serving a cause greater than himself. Those were always the most difficult cases, because belief doesn't leave a paper trail and faith can't be photographed. The second courier was discovered almost by accident. Her name was Elena Sokolov, 28 years old, a translator who worked freelance for various organizations including the United Nations office in New York, though she spent most of her time in the Washington area. She was born in the United States to Russian émigré parents who had left the Soviet Union in the 1950s. She spoke both languages fluently, moved easily between both cultures, and had relatives still living in Leningrad, which gave the KGB leverage if they needed it, though in her case, leverage wasn't necessary. Like Marsh, she was a true believer. She had visited the Soviet Union twice, both times on cultural exchange programs. Both times carefully monitored by KGB handlers who assessed her potential and determined she could be useful. Elena's role was different from Marsh's. She didn't collect information, she transmitted it. She traveled frequently, often to Montreal, sometimes to Mexico City, cities where Soviet intelligence had strong operational bases and where meetings could be arranged with less scrutiny than in Washington. The FBI identified her through surveillance of Volkov's apartment building. She visited him once, late at night, carrying a small bag, staying for less than 20 minutes. The visit seemed innocuous, a friend stopping by. Perhaps a romantic connection, but the FBI noted it because Volkov had no friends, no social life, no connections outside his cover identity. They ran her name through databases and found the travel history, the Soviet connections, the pattern of movement that didn't quite fit the life of a freelance translator. They began watching her too. The network was taking shape. Volkov at the center, passing classified documents obtained through his work. Reznikov as the handler, directing operations and providing guidance from the safety of diplomatic cover. Marsh collecting supplementary information from open sources. Elena transmitting the material abroad through couriers or dead drops in third countries. It was a small network, deliberately kept small to reduce the risk of exposure, but effective. For 7 years they had operated without detection, passing secrets that didn't individually seem critical, but collectively represented a significant intelligence breach. And they might have continued indefinitely if not for a phone call that scared Volkov into making a mistake. And a bartender who remembered a newspaper. Frank Delano knew none of this. After his breakfast conversation with Ray, he had gone back to his life, back to the bar. Back to the endless routine of pouring drinks and wiping counters and listening to other people's problems. Ray had asked him for the envelope, said it might be important, and Frank had given it to him without much thought. He assumed it would lead nowhere, like most things in life. But a few weeks later, Ray called him and said the FBI wanted to talk. Frank's first reaction was panic. He wasn't a criminal, but no one likes hearing that federal agents want to ask questions. Ray assured him he wasn't in trouble. They just needed information about Volkov, about his habits, his behavior, anything Frank could remember. The interview took place in a small office at the FBI field office on 4th Street. 2 agents, both men in dark suits, both with a kind of bland professional courtesy that made it impossible to tell what they were thinking. They asked Frank to describe Volkov in detail. What did he drink? What time did he arrive? Did he ever meet anyone? Did he ever seem nervous, afraid, angry? Frank answered as best he could, but the truth was he didn't know much. Volkov had been a regular customer, nothing more. The agents thanked him, told him his information was helpful, and asked him not to discuss the conversation with anyone. Frank agreed. As he left the building, he felt a strange disconnection, as if he had stumbled into someone else's story and was now being written out of it. He went back to work. The bar was the same. The customers were the same. Everything was the same, except now Frank couldn't stop thinking about the man he had known as Victor. Wondering who he really was and what kind of life requires that much secrecy. The FBI closed the net slowly, methodically, over the course of 18 months. They didn't rush. They couldn't afford to. Every piece of evidence had to be documented. Every link in the chain had to be confirmed. Every legal requirement had to be met because once they moved, there would be no second chance. They obtained warrants to tap Volkov's phone, to search his apartment, to monitor his bank accounts. They coordinated with the CIA to identify what information had been compromised and how much damage had been done. They briefed congressional intelligence committees in closed sessions, explaining the operation and the need for patience. And they waited for the right moment. That moment came in October 1984. 18 months after Frank Delano handed an envelope to his friend Ray. The FBI had everything they needed. Evidence of espionage. Evidence of conspiracy. Evidence that would hold up in court. They had identified every member of the network except Reznikov, who remained untouchable behind his diplomatic shield. On the morning of October 9th, FBI agents arrested Yuri Volkov at his apartment in Arlington. He didn't resist. He didn't seem surprised. He asked for a lawyer and then said nothing else. On the same morning, agents arrested Robert Marsh at the Library of Congress and Elena Sokolov at her apartment in Georgetown. The arrests were coordinated down to the minute, designed to prevent any of them from warning the others. By noon, all 3 were in federal custody. Reznikov, the handler, was expelled from the United States within 72 hours, declared persona non grata, and put on a flight to Moscow with his family. He would never return. The Soviet embassy issued a statement calling the arrests a provocation, claiming the evidence was fabricated, insisting that the expelled diplomat was an innocent cultural worker being scapegoated for political purposes. The State Department responded with its own statement, carefully worded, confirming that Soviet intelligence operations had been disrupted and that the United States would not tolerate espionage on its soil. Neither statement mentioned Frank Delano. The trial of Yuri Volkov lasted 6 weeks and was closed to the public for national security reasons. The evidence was overwhelming. Classified documents found in his apartment, photographs of classified materials, recordings of his meetings with Reznikov. Testimony from FBI agents who had conducted the surveillance. Volkov's defense attorney argued that his client had been entrapped, that the evidence was circumstantial, that the government hadn't proven intent. The jury didn't believe him. On January 15, 1985, Yuri Antonovich Volkov was convicted on 11 counts of espionage and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. He showed no emotion when the sentence was read. He was transferred to the federal penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, a maximum security facility where the most dangerous prisoners were kept in permanent solitary confinement. He would spend the next 16 years in a cell measuring 7 by 12 feet, with 1 hour of exercise per day in a concrete yard. No contact with other prisoners, no visits from family, because he had none, at least none that he acknowledged. In 2001, as part of a prisoner exchange negotiated in the brief thaw of relations between Russia and the United States following the September 11th attacks, Volkov was released and deported to Russia. He was 69 years old, gaunt, gray, broken by years of isolation. He returned to a country that no longer existed. The Soviet Union had collapsed a decade earlier. The KGB had been restructured. The Cold War was over. He received a pension from the Russian government in recognition of his service. He lived in a small apartment in a suburb of Moscow. He died in 2009 from heart failure. His obituary in Russian newspapers described him as a veteran intelligence officer who had served his country with honor. It didn't mention the bartender. Robert Marsh pleaded guilty to conspiracy and received a sentence of 20 years. He served 14 before being released on parole. He moved to Oregon, changed his name, and worked as a librarian in a small town where no one knew his history. He never spoke publicly about his case. Elena Sokolov also pleaded guilty and received 15 years. She was released in 1997, moved to Canada, and disappeared from public record. The network was destroyed. The operation was over. And Frank Delano, who had triggered it all with a casual observation over breakfast, knew nothing about any of this until 5 years later. In 1988, a reporter from the Washington Post contacted Frank at the bar. The reporter was working on a story about Cold War espionage cases that had been recently declassified. He had obtained documents through a Freedom of Information Act request and had come across Frank's name in FBI files as a confidential source who had provided initial information leading to the arrest of a Soviet spy. The reporter wanted to interview him. Frank was stunned. He had never thought of himself as a source, had never considered that his conversation with Ray had led to anything significant. He agreed to meet with the reporter at a coffee shop near the bar. Over 2 hours, the reporter explained everything who Volkov really was, what the network had been doing, how Frank's observation about the nervous customer and the forgotten envelope had started the entire investigation. Frank listened in silence, trying to reconcile the quiet man who drank vodka tonics with the image of a Soviet spy. When the reporter finished, Frank asked if he would be named in the article. The reporter said yes. That was the point of the story, to show how ordinary citizens sometimes play crucial roles in national security without even knowing it. Frank thought about it for a long time. Then he asked the reporter not to use his name. He didn't want the attention, didn't want to be known as the bartender who caught a spy, didn't want his life to become a story in someone else's narrative. The reporter was disappointed but agreed. The article ran without Frank's name, referring to him only as a local bartender who noticed suspicious behavior. Frank read it once, folded the newspaper, and never spoke about it again. He continued working at the Federal Lounge for another 12 years until the bar closed in 2000, a victim of rising rents and changing neighborhoods. He retired, moved to a smaller apartment, lived on Social Security and a modest pension. He rarely thought about Volkov, and when he did, it was with a strange sadness. Not for the man's crimes, but for the loneliness that had surrounded him, the life spent pretending to be someone else. Frank died in 2014 at the age of 78. His daughter found a folder in his apartment containing newspaper clippings about the Volkov case, carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. She didn't know why her father had kept them. She threw them away when she cleaned out the apartment. The Cold War ended, but its ghosts never entirely disappear. They live in declassified files and forgotten newspapers, in the memories of people who were there, and the silences of those who can't speak. Yuri Volkov was one spy among thousands. His network was one operation among hundreds. And his capture was one victory in a war that had no front lines and no clear ending. The information he passed to Moscow was eventually deemed to have caused moderate damage to national security, not catastrophic, not negligible. Somewhere in between, the kind of assessment that satisfies no one and changes nothing. The real damage, perhaps, was subtler. It was in the understanding that anyone could be anyone, that the man sitting next to you in a bar could be living a life you couldn't begin to imagine, that trust was a luxury and paranoia was a survival skill. Frank Delano had noticed something wrong and mentioned it to a friend, that's all. He hadn't been heroic, he hadn't been brave. He had simply paid attention in a world that increasingly demanded people look away. And in doing so, he had set in motion a machinery of surveillance and investigation that eventually ground down 3 lives and exposed a network that had operated in shadows for nearly a decade. There is no moral to this story, no lesson that fits neatly into a conclusion. There is only the recognition that small moments have consequences we can't predict, that observation is a form of power, and that the Cold War, for all its grand ideologies and nuclear arsenals, was ultimately a war fought between individuals, people making choices, people keeping secrets, people noticing what they weren't supposed to notice. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, not because they're heroic, but because they're true, consider subscribing. There are many more Cold War stories buried in forgotten files, stories of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, stories that reveal how fragile the line between peace and catastrophe really was. Yuri Volkov died believing he had served his country with honor. Frank Delano died thinking he had done nothing more than wipe down a bar and remember a customer's face. Both men were right, and both men were wrong. The truth, as always in the Cold War, lies somewhere in the space between what people believed and what actually happened, a space filled with silence, suspicion, and the weight of choices made without ever knowing their full cost.